the bottom of the slide is actually a quote from the Kentucky Resolution from Thomas Jefferson. And it says, in questions of power then, let no more be heard of confidence in man, bind him down from mischief by the chains of the Constitution. So when he's actually talking about this, he's referring to this idea of nullification. So we'll go through the origins of nullification in our country, past examples, and then, like Mike was referring to, we'll talk a little bit more about the present-day usage of nullification. But it's not just for the healthcare bill, it's actually used in a bunch of other topics. Next slide. So the origins of nullification in America, it all kind of starts with the idea of state sovereignty. The states created the federal government, not vice versa. When our country was first started, it was as colonies, so 13 colonies banded together to fight off the British. After the war ended, or actually during the middle of the war, after Yorktown in 1781, the precursor to the Constitution, our first Constitution really, the Articles of Confederation was signed. And this was an agreement that had very little federal power. It was a very small body, and the states were pretty much given all the rights to do whatever they wanted. Then from 1781 to 1787, which was when the Constitution was ratified, there was a debate which was covered more or less in the Federalist Papers, but was really discussed all over America. And the debate was whether they should actually have a stronger federal government to run not just the foreign policy, but to do a little bit more than that. And what ended up happening was there was this great debate because the anti-federalists were concerned that the federal government would grow out of control and would trump over the states' rights. And that's pretty much what's happened. And they had just left from Great Britain, and they had wanted to avoid also like this, the idea of this monarchy, like Alexander Hamilton, whose face is on the $10 bill these days. He actually wanted to appoint like the president for life, and for a little while. So, state sovereignty, the states created the federal government, not vice versa. While they were having this discussion, in the Virginia Ratifying Convention and several other conventions, what they did cover was the Anti-Federalists were okay with ratifying it as long as the powers that were expressly delegated to the states and that Virginia, in this case, would be exonerated from actually having to follow anything. So when the Constitution was passed and ratified, it was done under the understanding that the states didn't have to follow it if they got outside the bounds of the Constitution. So if they started behaving in an unconstitutional manner. So they wrote in the 9th Amendment and the 10th Amendment into the Constitution. The 10th Amendment states that the power is not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited to it by the states, or reserved to the states respectively or to the people. So again, like what we have going on in our country with the centralized economic planning, that was never, a scope in the Constitution. They've tried to reinterpret the original intent of the founders to try and have the power over health care, the power over the land and natural resources of the states, and so on. So in 1798, the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions were passed. Thomas Jefferson was the author of these resolutions, but at the time it was anonymous. And they were passed during the presidency of John Adams, who was the second president. We were at a sort of a quasi-war with France, who had just helped us out in the Revolutionary War. And what Adams had passed, ostensibly to protect the United States, was something called the Alien Sedition Acts. And these were things where pretty much the president could decide to imprison anyone, if it was something they had written or if they had said. And also for immigrants from France and what have you. And the states didn't quite like this, and what they decided to do was to fight back against this by nullifying the laws. So again, nullification in the Kentucky Resolution is stated, whensoever the general government assumes undelegated powers, its acts are unauthoritative, void, and of no force. And again, with the Constitution, if it's not listed in there, if it's not in Article 1, Section 8 or somewhere else in the rest of the Constitution, the federal government just simply doesn't have the power delegated to it to operate. Next slide. This is from the Virginia resolution, and you can get them online. Tomorrow on the website, this presentation will be up, and it'll have links to the full resolutions where I've highlighted some of the important parts. But the most important part from the Virginia resolution is the states have the right or are in duty bound to interpose for arresting what they call the progress of the evil. So sometimes nullification is also called interposition. But what it really is the states decide, okay, inside our boundaries, inside our state boundaries, we are not going to follow the laws because we disagree with them and they're in violation of the Constitution. Next slide. And then there's, throughout history, this has been used actually quite a bit. The first example of nullification was the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. Again, this was about 10 years before the Civil War, and the Fugitive Slave Act was if slaves escaped from the southern slave states into any of the northern territories, they were bound to return these slaves back to the state where they originally came from. However, the abolitionists, who were the ones that were completely all about getting rid of slavery, they favored just complete nullification. And in the territory of Wisconsin, there was flyers and a lot of activity to make the Fugitive Slave Act in that entire state just be null and void. So if a slave did make it there, they called it human kidnapping, to kidnap this person who escaped and send him back to the southern states. The military attempted conscription of minors. I believe this was for the War of 1812, although I'm not 100%. It was right around the beginning of the 1800s. And probably the most famous example of nullification was with South Carolina. And they voted down the tariffs that were in 1828 and 1832. And these tariffs were imposed on the southern states to kind of force them, instead of buying the cheaper industrial goods from Europe, that they would have to buy from the northern states, which made comparable goods but at a much higher cost. This will, and again, South Carolina made mostly agricultural goods, and this would later lead, this same very issue with the tariffs would lead to the Civil War about 30 years later. But at the time, South Carolina said, we aren't going to follow these tariffs for our ports, and the federal government did back down. And something that's not, the New England states, so a little bit northeast of here, for the War of 1812, they were calling up the militia to go invade Canada, and a lot of the New England states were like, we trade with Canada, they're not such bad people, and they rejected the calling up of the militia for that war.